Well, good morning, church. It's great to be back with you, and I want to thank Tillman for last week. Very much appreciate that. Today, I wanted to begin by asking you a question. And the question is, if you could make one rule that the entire world had to follow, what rule would you make? If you could make one rule, what would it be? What's the rule that you would make that would make the world a better place? You see, often we discover that there are little rules that we wish everyone followed. Here's 10 of them. If you open it, close it. If you turn it on, turn it off. If you unlock it, lock it back. If you move it, put it back. Are y'all liking these so far? If it belongs to someone else, get their permission first. If you borrow it, return it. If you don't know how to operate it, leave it alone. If you use it, take care of it. If you break it, replace it or fix it. And if you mess it up, you clean it up. You know, I showed these to students this past week, and I said, wouldn't these be nice for your dorm room? You know, just to have some rules that help us to live in harmony with each other. And what I want us to understand about what Tillman presented to us last week on the 10 Commandments is that God gathered His people after He had led them out of Egypt, after He had delivered them from the Red Sea. He brought them to this place and He said, I want to give you some rules that allow us to live together. I want you to understand that there are some standards that I want to present to you that if you'll follow these, we can live in harmony with one another. And what you remember is even while God is giving these rules to Israel, Israel is rebelling against them. And one of the things that we noticed about the 10 rules that I just presented to you is we want everybody else to follow them, but we can sometimes be the exception to that rule, can't we? Yeah, we borrow things and we don't return them. And so what we discover is that we need rules to live by, especially if we want God to live in our midst. I found this version of the 10 Commandments I thought you'd appreciate too, the cowboy version of the 10 Commandments. Just one God, put nothing before God, and watch your mouth. Get yourself to Sunday meeting, honor Ma and Pa, no killing, no fooling around with another fellow's gal, don't take what ain't yours, no telling tales or gossip, and don't be hankering for your buddy's stuff. The 10 Commandments. Texas form. And so today we come to the wanderings in the wilderness. And what I want you to understand is that we're going to cover a lot of ground today. We're basically looking at the highlights of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And because these are your favorite books and you read them regularly, I figured it's okay to just hit the high points today because I know that you'll be reading them over and over again this month. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is where you've started through the chronological Bible time after time and you've gotten to Leviticus and you've picked up something else, right? Well, today I want us to at least appreciate Leviticus because I met with a Jewish woman who teaches at Vanderbilt recently. Her name's Amy Jill Levine. And when I was asking her what she thinks is the most important book of the Bible, we were pretty much in sync that Genesis is so important. But she said, you know, the second most important book to me is the book of Leviticus because it tells us how to treat God and it tells us how to treat one another. You see, there are three things that God is dealing with Israel as they're wandering in the wilderness. And these three questions are, what are the guidelines for how to treat me and how to treat each other? Where is God to stay in their midst? And how can sin be atoned for? And so the 10 Commandments last week were God's guidelines if you want God to dwell in your midst. I mean, you can't just do anything you want. You can't just live any way you want and be in fellowship with God. God doesn't work that way. God says, if you want me in your midst, invite me into your midst. If you want me in your midst, live by the standard that I can dwell in your midst with you. And so God gives the 10 Commandments. But remember the second thing? God says, I need a place to stay. And so the book of Leviticus lays out this tabernacle, this traveling tent, this tent temple that God says you can place right in the middle of your camp. And I will, just like I did in the Garden of Eden, I will allow my presence to reside there. And if you read all the intricacies and the ornate descriptions of the tabernacle, you get this sense that it was a little Eden that was in the midst of God's people. And God said, if you'll live by my standard, if you'll obey me, I will dwell in your midst. And so God said that the cloud that led them in the day and the fiery pillar that led them at night, that presence of God would descend into their midst and dwell with them. But God said for that to be maintained, number 3, sin has to be atoned for. And so the book of Leviticus gives us all kinds of opportunities to atone for sin, but also to say thank you to God. And the whole book of Leviticus is trying to tell people, this is how you say thank you to God. This is how you get in peace with God. This is how you ask for forgiveness from God. This is how you deal with the guilt that you're carrying around. You're not even sure why, but you've got this guilt that's just weighing you down, and here's how you deal with that. And every year, here's how you atone for your sin as a nation. And so the book of Leviticus is God's way of saying, you can constantly be getting right with me so that I can dwell with you. You can be constantly getting right with me so that I can dwell with you. I would argue that what we did this morning is our opportunity to constantly be getting right with God so that God can dwell with us. God says, you can't just dwell with me and sin. That sin has to be dealt with. It has to be atoned for. And the book of Leviticus is giving us this picture of how they did it before Jesus. Remember, what they're doing is they're pushing sin forward like a layaway plan. The Hebrew writer says they're just pushing it forward, and they know that the blood of a bull and a goat can in no way compensate truly for the sin of a person, for the blood of a person. But God allows this substitute to just push it forward until God one day will dwell with it, will deal with it completely in Jesus. But if you picture the tabernacle, people are offering sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice to get themselves right with God. The priests are offering praise and sacrifice and prayer to get right with God. The book lays out these holidays that allow them to stop and to pause and to get right with God. A holiday is a day that's separate from the other days because it was used to get right with God. God says, I'll dwell in your presence if you will obey my word and carry it with you. And so they go on this journey with God, and they're headed towards the promised land. And that's what Leviticus is laying out for us. We get to the book of Numbers, and you know why it's called Numbers? Because there are 2 census in it. There are 2 times that God tells Moses to count the people. And they count the people by tribe, and they set them up on where they should pitch their tents, with the tabernacle in the center of all of God's people. And so Numbers begins to lay out the census and how they're going to dwell together as they wander through the wilderness. And you can picture the tabernacle right in the middle and God's people traveling through the desert. And what begins to happen? whining and whining and whining. Have you noticed that we are all gifted at whining? You know, there's no course at Lipscomb that's called Whining 101. You know why? Because we're born as experts at whining. We're great at grumbling and murmuring and complaining. We know how to do that really, really well. I got this for Suzanne. It sits on her desk. It says, no whining, no complaining, and absolutely no frowning. Hugs, smiles, and warm, fuzzy feelings are allowed. Thank you. But don't we live in a world of whining and murmuring and complaining? And what we read in the book of Numbers is that God's people, it didn't matter what he did, all they could do was look towards the future and whine about something that would happen. First, they whined because they were tired of eating manna. Manna is a word that means, what is it? They literally walked outside and they saw this white fluffy stuff on the ground. They named it manna and they began to eat it every day. And they got tired of eating it every day. And so they said, can't we have some meat? And they cried out to God, and God said, well, consecrate yourself and I will bring you meat. And they were like, how are you going to get meat in the middle of the desert for all these thousands of people? And the question was asked, is the Lord's arm too short? Are you thinking he really can't quite provide for you because he can't reach to you with what you need? Is God's arm too short? The next day, God changed the weather patterns and blew in all these quail. And there were so many quail coming down, people were getting hit with quail. It was all you could eat quail for the next 30 days until guess what happened? We're tired of quail. We're just sick of quail. And so we find them murmuring about that. And then Moses decides to send 12 spies into the land to go and to look over this beautiful and prosperous land. And I will tell you that I've lived in Israel and I've eaten grapes as big as my finger. It's like putting an explosion in your mouth. And God's people went and walked through the land, and they came back with all this wonderful produce from this land flowing with milk and honey. And then it was time for the 12 spies to make a report. And what we notice is that 10 had one report and 2 had another. And we read in Numbers chapter 13 that the 10 gave the children of Israel a bad report. They said, the land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw there are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight and in their sight. The people came back and said, it is a land flowing with milk and honey, but the people there are way too big for us. We can't fight them. They're out of our league. They're beyond anything we could possibly deal with. And the people began to murmur and to grumble and to complain. And they wanted to go back to Egypt, and they're whining in the wilderness. They chose rebellion, returning to Egypt, ingratitude, not appreciating all that God had done for them, and unbelief. The idea that God's arm was too short to do for them what they needed done. But the text tells us that Joshua and Caleb saw opportunity when the other 12 spies saw defeat. And Caleb stood up before the people and he said these important words, "Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they will be as bread to us." That's a way of saying we will devour them. Their protection has turned aside from them, but the Lord is with us. Don't fear them. But the people chose a bad report. But we learn something about Caleb here, that God blesses him because he saw things differently. And I love what it says. God says, because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to. His descendants will inherit it. I want you to ask the question, would you like to be called somebody who has a different spirit? Who follows God wholeheartedly? And I want us to understand that doesn't happen by accident. That happens from a life and a heart that is wholly devoted to God. And when people looked at Caleb, they said there's something different about him. He's wholeheartedly committed to God. It's interesting that the name Caleb is actually the Hebrew word for dog. And if you think about a dog and its commitment to its master, that's what Caleb was all about. Wholeheartedly, with a different spirit, he followed. But Israel chose 40 years in the wilderness because they listened to a bad report. They listened to a bad report. And they chose whining over winning. They chose boredom over battle. They chose conflict over conquest. And for the next 40 years, people didn't get to do what they were gifted to do. People wandered in the wilderness, wasting their gifts because they would not, with a whole heart, follow after God. And God said, you don't want the gift of the promised land? It's not what you're interested in? I won't give it to you. God won't force his gifts upon us if we don't want to receive them. And so they wandered. And they wandered, and they wandered, and they wandered. During the 40 years, we discover that Moses will get frustrated with the whining, and he'll hit a rock he was supposed to talk to, and he won't get to enter the promised land because of that. We'll discover that Aaron dies and his son Eleazar takes over, and it's his grandson that becomes a model for what zealous faith begins to look like, where he rights a wrong and purifies all of Israel and is known as a life that is zealous for God. And so we come to Deuteronomy. Moses' last speech, his last will and testament. It's his last opportunity to speak to Israel before God is going to take him with his fathers and bury him. And so we read in this book a second giving of the law. That's what Deuteronomy means. We get this text that becomes the most important text in all of Israel. It's recited every time they go to synagogue. It's in every Jewish family's home. It's one of the first things that rolls off of their tongue every day. Hear, O Israel, the Lord, your God, the Lord, He is one. Love God with all of your heart and your mind and your strength. This became the Shema of Israel. If you've ever been to a Jewish home, you'll realize that there is something just on the part of the door frame that has this, and it's a reminder that this is to constantly be what's being taught to their children. It's to constantly be on their mouth, and it's supposed to be that which really organizes their thoughts and their actions towards God. Deuteronomy ends with Moses saying these words, "For this commandment that I command you today isn't hard for you, and it's not far off. It is not in heaven, neither is it beyond the sea, but this word is near you, it's in your mouth, it's in your heart, and you can do it." Moses tells the people, obey God, be faithful. And he closes by saying, I've set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Therefore, choose life. And so from there, God takes Moses up on top of Mount Nebo and lets him look out over the promised land. On a clear day, you can see almost forever from the top of Nebo. You can see most of the major cities in Israel from the top. And after that, God buried Moses. So what do we get from a look at Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy? What is it that we need to notice? The first thing I want us to notice is that God allowed an entire generation, for the most part, to wander aimlessly because they would not choose to wholeheartedly follow him. They chose to listen to a bad report. And what I want us to notice about the world that we live in right now today is that all the marketing, all the studies have indicated that if you want to get people's attention, tell them bad news. Give them a bad report. Turn on CNN, turn on MSNBC, turn on Fox, and listen for just a couple of minutes, and they will tell you what's wrong with the world. And they will continue to tell you what's bad as long as you will listen. And what we've discovered is that people like to hear bad news. We embrace bad news. We embrace the gossip. We embrace those that tell stories that pull other people down. And what we have got to decide is that we are not going to be a people that focus on the bad report. Amen. That we are going to be different. You see, we've turned into a society that whines a lot. And we've got to decide it's time to stop whining. Wouldn't this be a great presidential campaign poster? Yeah. I'm campaigning for president, and what I'm going to do is tell everybody to stop whining. We're going to quit it. We are not going to make excuses and whine and grumble and murmur and complain. We're going to put our big boy pants on, and we are going to deal with it. Because Leviticus was trying to say, instead of grumbling and murmuring and whining and complaining, what you really need to do is thank God. You need to thank God for the good things. You need to be constantly thanking God for his graciousness towards you. Be the exception, not the rule. Because see, the people that were highlighted in our reading this week were the people who were exceptional, not everybody else. Decide that you will have a different spirit. Decide that you will follow God wholeheartedly. Decide that your life will be a life where your descendants will talk about you because of the way that you lived. I want us to be people with a different spirit. There's something different about them. It must be that they follow God wholeheartedly. We've got to be people that are zealous for God. That God is our priority. And that it's clear to other people that we don't compromise on God's standards. We don't wash down God's values. That we are zealous for God. And that we are humble. And that God uses humble people to change the world. Now, Wags read for us a passage that I want to close with. Because in the midst of their wandering in the wilderness in Numbers chapter 21, we discover that the people are whining and murmuring, complaining. We've been out here in the wilderness so long, and the food is horrible, and it's hot, and we're tired. And this manna stuff, I mean, come on, God, 6 days a week and double portion. I mean, God, can't we just, I wish we could just go back to Egypt, please. God says, oh, you don't like it? Okay, here. And he sent venomous snakes into the camp. And all of a sudden, people are getting bit. And when you get bit, the poison goes into your body. And pretty much people are just, and then they're keeling over. And people are dying. And all of a sudden they're like, God, I'm so sorry. We love the food. I mean, this manna stuff, it's fantastic. And we're just, God, we're so sorry. God, please, whatever it takes, just take the snakes away, please. So Moses goes to God and says, God, they're sorry. And God says to Moses, I want you to make a bronze snake, and I want you to put it on a pole. And just put it up in the middle of the camp. And all this dying stuff will begin to end. And people, tell them to turn their eyes and gaze at the snake on the pole. And they'll live. This story reminds us that the great serpent, Satan, has been unleashed in the camp. And the problem that I have, and the problem that you have, and you have, is we've been snake bit. And the venom of sin and of death has entered into us. And there was no known antidote that could deal with it. People were dying. But then God said, no, lift this one up and tell everyone to put their gaze upon him, and they'll be healed. And you might remember that Jesus picks up this story in John chapter 3 and says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. And then the passage that you know better than probably any other one comes next. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. We have been snake bit. Jesus has come with the antidote. And what we have been told to do is to turn our eyes upon Jesus. Look to the cross and see in him the one that has taken away our sin and has allowed us to live free and forgiven. So turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things on earth that you'd like to whine about this week will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. If you've never received the antidote for the sin that has infected you, you need Jesus Christ as your Lord and your Savior. You need to be baptized into his name. You need to be washed clean with him. You need the antidote that overcomes sin, which is Christ in us, the hope of glory. But for those of us who have really just gotten to where we're seeing the negative in every situation, let's turn our eyes upon Jesus this week. Let's have a different spirit, and let's follow God wholeheartedly and see if there's not joy that is found there. And if we can minister to you in any way, that's why we're here. And we encourage you to come to the front as we stand and sing this song together.